My name's Glyn Pooley, and I'd like to talk about art. This time, my subject is...
the art of portraiture. Let's take a journey anyway. Okay, so we'll go back quite a long way, over 3,000 years, just so we can see how important portraiture has been. This famous image is something which is, as we could say, is an icon that kind of people are aware of all over the world. And it kind of just transcends time now for us. But you can see the amount of work and effort that's gone into this image. And in more recent times, the artists and scientists have made reconstructions of how the boy Tutankhamen looked. He was revered as a deity in his life, and he only lived till he was 19, but he left this everlasting presence in our world, or inspired it, should we say. So transcending time, we've seen about the importance of portraiture. We jump to the 1500s. Portraiture between those times really was, and particularly in terms of painting, was not something which was really practiced. You had icons, of course, but not really figurative images of real people. All right, there's a couple of earlier Renaissance, pre-Renaissance pictures. I'm thinking of Giotto, people like that, where in collective portraits they had images of people, but not of a specific person. Hence, we got Albrecht Durer here. And this is particularly interesting because he has taken this image, this full frontal image of himself, and that was the way portraits, if you like, were portrayed before this period for the image of spiritual icons like Jesus. Before this, if a portrait was going to be made, Durer made 3 portraits, but the other that we've got a record of, but the other 2 were all in 3/4 viewpoint, which is what we start to see appearing. But if you want to have a very strong dialogue with your viewer, of course, taking this full frontal image really engages with them. This is an oil painting, and it was painted on board, and it's got a kind of mystical kind of quality. So it's of its time. It's deeply it's got a deep resonance with its culture, but it's also got this kind of quality where it's got a contemporary look to it. The icon image here, which is, as I said, is referred to the kind of Jesus image of the previous centuries. This image has started to be adapted after this was created, and it became an iconic image of what maybe the Jesus would look like, with the browns and this sallow skin and this long hair. But it's his gaze, I think, which is really important in terms of how he engage with us. He looks at us, but he kind of looks through us as well. So there's a transcendent quality. His treatment of the fur and the details in his hair are again something which is characteristic of Durer, that attracted lots of attention. And he also was into woodcuts as well, so he was able to disseminate these images quite widely. So I suppose our point is, in this case, strong dialogue. If you're looking directly at the viewer, you can kind of almost create something which has got a living soul, and the viewer is going to engage more deeply with that. And then we've got one of the greatest portrait painters of all time, Rembrandt. What creates a great portrait, I suppose you could say? And one of the answers would be the dialogue you have with that sitter in that picture. Does the portrait give us an opportunity to see that person's living form. It's almost like as if, yeah, you're connecting with their soul, if you like. It's a soul-to-soul connection. And Rembrandt painted many self-portraits right throughout his life, documenting, representing himself to himself, basically, to find out a little bit more of what it is to be human from his perspective. And this one was painted right at the end of his life, in the year that he passed on. And you can see that he doesn't shy away from all the kind of details of his lived-in experience. And that comes across in the way he's painted himself. As you can see, he's used those kind of earthy colours that we saw in Durer as well, which was part of a tradition of this era, but also creates a timelessness in the image. Keeping his background relatively simple enables us to focus on the face itself and, of course, the eyes, which we get the opportunity to engage with. So it's the eyes, it's the look, it's the direct connection. It's the representing of the artist's self to themselves strongly enough that then it transcends that experience and then reaches us. And then the other dimension, of course, you've got in this is the light. So the light is shining on the artist's left-hand side as we look at it, but the light is at the center of this image as well. And we're often, as you know, we are drawn to the light. So having the dark around it enables us to kind of focus on that particular area. These images, although they're 400 years old nearly, when you're in front of them, they seem to have this life force. And that's what enables us to have this strong dialogue with them. And hence they become icons of portraiture. Rembrandt was technically very gifted as well. And you see this beautiful, fresh brushstrokes that he has. We don't always have to have really, really sharp lines to define something specifically. We can see that the painterly quality of the soft line, a soft mark, works really well in an image like this. And a lot of the great masters kind of use that technique. Most of their lives seem to follow a trajectory where their painting is quite detailed and linear at the beginning of their career, and then it moves off and gets softer and softer as they progress, as they kind of understand mark making more, and they understand the nature of the materials, and they create a sort of shorthand to get to the essence or the specific of what they're trying to create. In this case, is that intense connection for the viewer. And another master, of course, is Vermeer. This is a self-portrait of him seen from behind, which is very clever. So maybe mirrors were in used then, unless he's got eyes in the back of his head, but nothing would surprise me with Vermeer. Anyone that's seen his pictures, they're again transcendent and magical. They seem to have a presence of all of their own. And here we got the artist painting this model, as we can see on the easel there, with all the accoutrements of the time in the studio around, maps of distant travel on the back wall, fine drapery. He's dressed in his Sunday best to the berry, but he manages to create in his portraits a stillness. And we just talked about space and we talked about light in Rembrandt, and the same thing happens here. We know the kind of characteristics, the key characteristics work to create this element of magic, if you like, or transcendence. We've got the light in this case on the model in the background. That's the strongest, most lit area, and it's right at the center again, as it was in Rembrandt's. So we're drawn to that area. And then we talked about the space as well. So you can see he's created flat areas within the picture. Up here, there's a relatively little tone and a flat area, flat design area in the map, etc. And again, that creates this opportunity to create space. The drape is very clever in the foreground. because it's almost like we've peeled that drape back and we're looking in on something, but it creates a lot of three-dimensional space. So we've seen portraits of single people here, but you've got a portrait, a self-portrait of the dynamic quality between the sitter and the artist here. So more than one person. So, when you're thinking about your portrait, there's many ways of kind of capturing. You can kind of define characteristics of your sitter by placing another person near them or around them. And then the dynamic between the two creates an indication of that person. It's a way of just building up character, building up characteristics. And then, of course, we've got Van Gogh, who another artist that made many self-portraits as well. Even in a relatively short period of time, he loved his self-portraits and he loved painting people that were close to him. I suppose self-portrait is something that artists do because it's kind of very convenient, but also people close to you, maybe they're a little bit more tolerant of your quirks and characteristics, and then they more freely sit for you. But this one is interesting because as well as having the internal information of the face and what is the character of the figure, we've got Van Gogh using symbolic color around. So we talked about flatness, but that choice of color is something that's very definitely being picked by Van Gogh to expose a certain aspect of the characteristic of the sitter. So think about your color scheme as well. Think about what color does for you, how it moves you, and then how that color could be portrayed or used in your portrait to say something about the person you're trying to portray. If you have large flat colors like this, of course, you're then emphasizing that part of the characteristic in the sitter. If you have lots of different colors, small colors, then again, that says something else about the sitter. It's the dialogue between the colors become part of that relationship. Okay? Every color will say something else about your sitter, your relationship with that sitter. So don't get too technical, maybe, but just think about it, think how color moves you and then use that relationship in the person you're trying to portray. Here again, you can see Van Gogh uses color to give us an insight into a psychological state of the sitter. We often see yellow used in Van Gogh's pictures, don't we? And of course, yellow is an iconic color, is a symbol of, that can be related to gold, it can be related to the sun, but it can also be related to certain emotional states. And if we use it in that particular way, again, we manage to create information for the viewer to get an insight into the sitter's personality or temperament. And then we can reinforce that. We can reinforce that by the reflection of the color and the shape in the flowers that he's put around the outside as well. So these are like, if you like, in terms of Van Gogh's thinking, maybe these are like little mini portraits. Okay, these could be like little mini faces talking to him. Because he was an artist that kind of got to a place where he understood the world in all its interconnectivity. For him, a portrait, a flower is a part of nature as we are part of nature. So we can use them in a kind of what became later a symbolist way of expressing our relationship with our world, and in this case, the portrait. So you can imagine there she is sitting there, rocking this cradle of this little baby that we can't see, surrounded by all the little smiles of these little flowers around her. Might even cheer her up, you never know. But it's about the interconnectivity of the relationship and his understanding of nature in that perspective. The greens as well, they set up a completely different feel. Okay? You get a very different feel by the use of color from this portrait to this, as you can see. It's amazing how different color, what difference color can make. So experiment and explore your colors, see how they kind of move you. Sometimes test it with your friends, or if it is a particular sitter that you're making a picture of, ask them what their favorite color is. Have a dialogue about it. Show them some colors, see how they respond to them as well. And then if it becomes a certain character, if certain things start to appear and reappear in that dialogue, then you can include them in the portrait. Okay, this is the sort of thing Van Gogh would have been contemplating when he was making these pictures. Obviously, of course, at that time as well, there was a lot of information going on about color theory, post-impressionist work, the impact of color, and he wrote copious notes in his diary about his relationship with color and how that would kind of move the viewer. So think about the color in that relationship. He's on this blue period here, love him. When wasn't he? It's very powerful picture again. What we just talked about in relationship of the flowers is particularly interesting, and them being little mini faces and being at one with the figure. Here you've got these swirls, which are like life forces, which run in and out of the figure. They go over his body, they go into the background, they're everywhere. They're just a life force, but they're a life force of a certain kind of coloration again, and a certain kind of dynamic mark. We haven't mentioned dynamic mark yet. Now, that's another indicator of the kind of information you can share about your sitter. Are they the sort of sitters that have got a lot of energy? If so, you can use kind of strong, intense brush marks, maybe. Are they kind of contemplative and reflective? Well, you can use the mark in a way which is more still, more horizontal, more Vermeer-esque, if you like, to say something about their character. The light again in this picture, as you can see, is right in the center. It's often the case, and that inspires us to look at his eyes and look at his intense gaze, and that draws us in, and then we're into this eternal dialogue with this living force that sits on the page. So again, we're repeating, seeing certain artistic characteristics these arts use it. And then we jump to Gwen, John. Okay. Interesting here that I put this in because you can see from the difference between a drawing and a painting. You can see how they're kind of linked up. So sometimes you don't have to make a big oil painting or an oil painting to say as much as you want about a sitter. A drawing can be just as important because it could have an immediate sensitivity to it. It can have a delicateness. It can kind of give us different levels of insight. And, she obviously discovered herself through both these kinds of qualities. There's a delicate, sensitive nature of the drawing. And then in a painting at this stage, which was an early picture for her, you see this strong image, this idea of a strong artist striding out into their career, being kind of portrayed. But as a painting has developed, later on, she sort of falls somewhere between the two. Her pictures become beautiful paintings, but they're very delicate and they got a deep sensitivity to them. So it's about how you explore, how you find your relationship with the sitter. Okay, sometimes the quickness of or the immediacy of a drawing can get you and say a lot more or as much as something which is maybe being painted over a number of hours, days, or weeks. Explore your mediums, basically. Be open to your mediums and find the one that works for you in relation to portraiture. It's interesting to see how artists kind of explore these different kind of qualities. Now, we know Picasso, in this case, as a cubist painter and the cubist quality of multifaceted viewpoints. So he's using a kind of artistic philosophy here. This is post his cubist period specifically, but the residue, of course, is clearly seen here in the picture of Dora Maar. He manages to create a deep psychological state here, and a living force as well. We see a head moving from 3/4 length to the side view, all presented in at one point. And we see her hands moving in a repeated patterns, and he manages to create symbolic imagery all overlaid, one layer on top of the other, in one particular unified image. He's got her shoulders, which become these black wings. We've got the use of the color black with all its connotations. Of course, this was a time when Picasso was having a particularly difficult relationship with Dora. I think they just split up, and that kind of comes across. And he's emphasized the angularity and the fractiousness of their experience, operated and contrasting that with the white space all around. It's not a settled space by any means. There's lots of marks. There's lots of kind of feelings of fractiousness, if I suppose one of a better word, all around the picture. So in this case, we're starting to look at how shape can impact your portrait. Okay, not soft round shapes and forms like we had in the Rembrandt. Angular shapes create angular spiky feelings. Again, it could be part of the characteristic. Interesting how he's used the yellow again as a psychological state bearer, like we saw in Van Gogh. And then you've got this multifaceted look as well. So a way of creating a certain level of three-dimensionality, and someone living through the experience of moving through time and space. Multiple viewpoints, the chair split out in two different viewpoints simultaneously. You can use all these kind of motifs to build into your portrait, depending on the character of the person and your relationship with them. And then we got Frida Kahlo, 1941. Her relationship with her husband, Diego Rivera, the Mexican muralist. But poor old Frida had quite a troubled and tough life, in terms of physical issues, physical problems, emotional relationships with Diego, etc. The turbulent life of the artist. Love us. But because often she was bedbound because she had an accident in her early 20s, she that took to painting, and her world became her house and her confines. And here in her house, she used to keep all kinds of exotic pets, monkeys, parrots, all kinds of things, and she incorporated them into her portraits. Okay, so it's just another way of us giving layers of information about the sitter. So maybe you make a portrait of someone that is passionate about dogs. You can include their dog or cats, or they might have a pet budgie. You never know. You might even have a pet crocodile. Now that would be something else, wouldn't it? But it would say something about the sitter. So you can include them around the figure, and it just tells us more and more information. Eh? We've still got key characteristics that a lot of the portrait artists are using as well. This intense gaze, they're looking at us. We're led to the center of that face as well. Obviously, the red lips, red always draws you to the center. And that kind of gives us the opportunity to see this strong woman staring out at us. This unorthodox, challenging portrait, questioning her and us and our relationship in that case, as well as giving that information about her immediate life and the time and the place. So think about all these kinds of things when you're making your portrait. Just let them kind of wash around you, if you like. Sometimes when you're making a portrait of someone, it's quite useful just to take a few little notes, have a conversation with them, if you get an opportunity, if you're working from life, and just find out a little bit more about them, what kind of interests them, what kind of life they've lived, what kind of characters and characteristics they like to present, because we got to get through this sense of a mask. Frida painted a number of self-portraits as well. I suppose she was the forerunner of the selfie, if you like. It became a iconic image. And we mentioned the word icon. Those Christian icons and Greek related icons. They are meditative pieces, that have got deep resonance. And these artists are kind of using that kind of process to share the information that they want about their sitter. And we just talked about icons, and this is Andy Warhol from the 60s using a cultural icon in that particular way. He's presenting her, of course, in a number of different states. We talked about colour and the impact of colour. He's also part of this critique about consumerism, of course, with Andy Warhol, the famous soup can, but repeating the image over and over and over. The idea of production, the impact that has on a human being in lots of the ways. From his framework, they would dehumanize a person. And then, of course, with Marilyn, it ended in quite a tragic life. So it's amazing what you can kind of put together when you're creating your image of your figure. You might want to have multiple images represented together to give you different facets of that person. You might have a triptych, or in this case, 9 or whatever. They might have a favorite number. You could make your portrait out of the favorite number. Whatever you feel will say a little bit more about your sitter or their relationship with the world. Sometimes the most difficult thing when you're making a portrait in front of someone is to not, there's going to be an element of you, the artist, in it, but you want to be able to make it all about them as well. So it's about engaging with that kind of dialogue. With Andy Warhol here, he was seeing him more as a cultural icon, but he lived his life as a cultural icon himself. So again, he had that connection, which enabled him to make a painting which, again, transcends time. And then you've got Francis Bacon. Got arresting imagery, I think you got with Francis Bacon, 40s, 50s, 60s, 1950s, 60s. He kind of would use old Polaroid photographs, and he would kind of paint on them and blend them and use materials to kind of distort them, and then they would become the kind of starting point for some of his imagery. He kind of was operating from a deep psychological state. He was trying to understand his relationship with the world in terms of his religion aspect, his animal states, his primal states, all that kind of thing, his deep emotional forces, and trying to portray all that in these images, which are kind of almost grotesque in a way, but also have got a deeply human quality in them as well. If you look at some of his other imageries, you can always make out the figure within this kind of quite desolate, simple interior room. But so there's a distance there, but they also speak to us about some deep psychological states that operate in all of us. It's interesting that he was operating around the time of Lucian Freud that we looked at before, who was making very figurative kind of images, and of course David Hockney, who made a very different kind of image. We'll have a look at one of his in a second. So all within that intense period, 40s, 50s, 60s, into the 70s, we've got these different psychological states being explored and developed by artists through the medium of portraiture. So we can do it to our level as well. It's interesting. I just thought it'd be interesting to put this in because some of these pictures painted in the 50s and late 60s. But this is a Welsh artist, Kuffyn Williams. Of course, we know of him. The difference between Bacon and Kuffyn Williams, fascinating. Similar colorations, as you can see there, but these are much more reserved in a way. on one level, they could be seen as quite conservative in their treatment. They're not exploring deep psychological states in a kind of dynamic way, but they're still giving us an intensity when we contemplate them, and giving us those opportunities to have that dialogue with those portraits, with those sitters, and still able to kind of put ourselves in the position of trying to understand what these sitters are thinking. They're often in Kuffyn's pictures. His figures look off the page, to the left, to the right, wherever. The difference between the confrontational image in one respect that we saw in the Albert Durer, where we have an immediate arrest in dialogue, is something different when you put your figure, or you design your figure to look out at the canvas. It says something else about them as well. It gives you an insight into their otherworldly thoughts, maybe their effacing presence, maybe their sensitivity, maybe their lack of confrontation, all these kinds of things, which are kind of different aspects and qualities. So how you place your figure on the canvas or on your board, and how you position them and where you get them to look, and all is telling us more and more information about your sitter and your portrait. Okay? So these are just things to kind of contemplate when you're choosing a subject, and if you're with that person, you're making a portrait of them, how you would kind of set them up, if you like. After you've known enough about them, you can kind of suggest to them to sit in a particular way, or look in a particular way, look at a particular point, away from you or to you, something like that. It just gives you an opportunity to share more about the sitter. And then we looked at Joan Eardley as well. She did some amazing pictures, as you remember. Lots of children in the Gaubles in Glasgow. Now, you get a different opportunity when you're painting children. Often they're moving and they've got a dynamic quality, but they've also got kind of openness, which is sometimes easier to read if you're sensitive. One of the biggest challenges to the portrait artist to make a portrait that is really got resonance is to get through the mask, the adult mask, because we all wear masks when we're out and about, and it takes a long time sometimes for that to drop for people. But with children, they don't wear it. They kind of just express and share what they are. Their presence is clear. Our challenge then is being able to capture that. So being open-hearted enough to be able to engage on that level. And Eardley was very good at that. She kind of got into their world. The children came into her studio and they surrounded her and became one with her. The way she painted as well had this beautiful childlike immediacy. The line just naturally flows. The colours have got colours of kind of uplift, like the pinks and the yellows in this way. It's a certain kind of yellow. The blues, the yellows, the decoration on the skirt there. And then she contrasts that by the psychological state and the way she's painted the faces. But she's captured them in charcoal and pastel here, which is a lovely immediate medium to get the vibrancy of that moving source. So again, we can be open to the choice of our materials in this way. Again, with this one, the two children with the chalk drawing behind, lovely textures created with their oil paints, but also nice kind of interaction between the two figures. That's what we're talking about. Multiple portraits there. Just give us a relationship between them and tell us more about how these two figures are kind of thinking and the life they're living. And her background is just as engaging as the figures. Yeah, bit of collage, bit of text, some gold leaf, silver leaf, newspapers of the times. You can use these kinds of different things all to find out and tell you more about your sitter. Whether they might like to read certain kind of newspapers, or they look at certain kind of magazines. Include them as collage into your picture, or they might be want to include old photographs. Cut them out, use them. Do a few different pictures, pencil drawings, charcoal pictures. Cut them up and stick them on and make a composite. Whatever it takes to save more and more and get closer and closer to your relationship with your sitter. The more you get into it and the more clear you are about that composition, the more the viewer gets to receive from it as well. And it's lovely one of the boy sitting there. Interesting how she's managed to get this boy's psychological state, similar to Kuffyn Williams in a way. His boy's looking away from the viewer, and there's got quite a defensive pose. He's got his arms crossed, but she uses these beautiful pinks again. These uplifting pinks and this beautiful yellow. Pink has a characteristic all of its own as well. It's high resonance color. It lifts the mood, often in a picture or a place. And you can see most things all around here is fairly grey and earthy. So if you took out that pink and that yellow, this could be a rather drab picture. But putting that in has really lifted the whole kind of focus up as well. So again, that's a reference on your choice of colours. She's got lovely things in the background happening as well. As we talk references to her other pictures or other drawings in her studios, which gives us a sense of place and a sense of the relationship for the models up there. All giving us more fascinating things to explore. And then we got David Hockney, is one of his portrait of his parents. Talk about color resonance here. He's really exploring it. These beautiful emeralds colors, and again those lovely yellows. The relationship between the two sitters gives us information about them, as well as his self-portrait in the mirror, and that's a backward kind of reference to the Vermeer that we saw right at the beginning, placing himself there. There's lots of qualities to this picture. It's a large painting, if you get to see it in front of it. There's about 10 foot, 12 foot, something like that. So scale is important. He's placed them on like as if they're in the theatre. They're up on a podium. There's drapes in the background, talking about the theatre of life. It's a theme that, of course, which Hockney explored all the way through his career. He created lots of sets for the opera and different things like that. So the theatre of life was a theme. And then the dynamic and the relationship, how we all kind of operate in that theatre. I love his use of different perspectives, and in terms of like this vase that sat there, those flowers are massive, heads on them compared to the size of his mum's head. So they're like liquid sunshine, aren't they? And then on the back wall as well, he suggested this scumbled black wall, and he's just put this yellow stripe, horizontal and vertical around, which just suggests an artificial doorway, some place that we can head towards. And he's framing himself as well within that doorway. So all the time we're going through spaces and spaces and spaces in this theatre he's kind of creating, and we're there somewhere. We are the imaginary viewer. We would be just over his right shoulder if we were looking into his mirror. So within that space, and we have to kind of imagine ourselves as part of that relationship there. But he's managed to capture some lovely qualities of his parents: the thoughtfulness, the sensitivity. His mum's like a little angel. She's almost like levitating off the floor. You can hardly see the chair she sat on. It's just hinted at ever so slightly. So, you don't have to be tied down to physical accuracy all the time. You can use that symbolic use of objects to say more about the relationship with the portrait and the sitter. So it's just an interesting one to study on lots of levels. Contrast, Jean-Michel Basquiat was a graffiti artist. became very big in the 80s. He had his star shone very brightly, and then it exploded. But here we've got what you call a very expressionistic interpretation of a portrait. He has kind of captured a feeling of the time, of course, for his culture in New York, where he worked. There was quite a few troubles going on, which actually is still going on to this day, aren't they? Different race riots, etc. Black Lives Matter, etc. But he's at the forefront of really passionately trying to get to grips with the relationship of the black person and their culture in a foreign land, if you like, in a New York state of mind, and how the dynamic of the two will kind of working together. So he's drawn this black person from the back, a rear view, back sounds close to black, which is from behind, so they're not really being seen on one level. The other aspect of it is we see the front, but we see the front as a mask, which of course is like the African mask of an ancient culture. It's two superimposed together, and then you've got these great big hands over the top, which are white hands over a black face and a black person, So there's multiple readings for it. They become symbolic interpretations where you can overlay one thing on top of the other to say more about your lived experience in a culture. So your portrait can be of a person, but your portrait can also be of a particular time, place, specific group of people, specific issue. All these kinds of things can go into it, and it can all be the bit that really triggers your interest and why you want to make a portrait as well. So, and then we got up close here. This is detailed art as it looks at these pictures again, very big. They're like 10 foot high, 10 foot wide. He started as a photorealist painter and developed later on into this kind of almost abstract pixelation of the figure. He did a lot of self-portraits, and you can see each of these squares, these little diamond shapes, have got little abstract, they're like little mini abstract pictures, one on top of the other. What you have to be concerned with if you're making a picture like this, of course, is the relationship with tone and shape. So it's, again, what's the motivation between your relationship to create this portrait? He said he was highly figurative when he started, photorealistic, which is a critique on the time in America, and then becoming looser as he develops, when he starts to use symbolic use of colors and more kind of what can we say, iconic qualities superimposed over each other. But when we see it as we stand back from it, we get to see the thing as a whole. It kind of is a forerunner to what later became digital technology, what became pixels, what became a fragmented nature of living, multifaceted. So the artist was kind of involved with and interested in those kinds of aspects of the portrait. People, we're all very complex. We all have many layers to us, and we're in a constant state of change and transition. How do you get that across? Well, if you pixelate something and you give it many, many small component parts that all need time to be constructed, and then you can hint at, work into those many layers and present them all simultaneously. So Chuck Close was exploring that aspect. You could do it if you've got the patience. Why not? Give it a go. And then we've got a portrait of a community here, in a way. Kevin Sinnot is, I think he was born in Bridgend or something. I think he's a Welsh artist anyway, and he's got a studio not far, just up the road. It might be in the Neath Valley. This is in the Cardiff Museum, and it's called "Running Away with a Hairdresser," which was maybe an interesting take on the time. I don't know if Kevin ran away with a hairdresser, but he obviously met someone that did. So it was a portrait of a Valleys community and his take on it. So there's humor in it, but it's also given us an insight into what that community maybe was like and is like. Anyone seen that program by Ruth Jones, Stella? That's a lovely portrait of a Valleys community as well. There's love, there's humor, there's kindness, there's connectedness, but there's also romance on a different way and a different level. And he's created this kind of dynamic image here as well, using kind of vibrant colors, expressive paint. And this is one of their most popular pictures in the museum. So it's, in its own way, it's become an iconic picture to portray Valley's community. And then obviously something a bit bigger. Often whenever you find yourself in a particular place, you might want to run away from time to time. You might want to go and explore something else or something different. It's a universal characteristic that maybe most people kind of explore at some time in their life. And by creating it in this portrait form in this respect, it connects with people. So you might start your portrait from a point of view of thought, that you want to portray. So I've put in a couple of things that I've done over the years as well, because I've made many, many portraits, often developing psychological portraits, if you like. The one on the left was from a lady I met in a local pub many years ago. And after the dialogue and the conversation and the connection, the picture kind of took a couple of years before it actually popped out. But on our interaction was one of a drawing and graphite drawing and a dialogue and notes and things like that. So it was interested in kind of psychological states. And the one on the left is made on board, which has been highly textured, as you can see, and then layered over with acrylic inks to give a kind of suggestion of a person that is there but not particularly solid. So they're transient. The marks, of course, can suggest a certain kind of psychological state. And because they've got three-dimensional quality to them, as the light hits it, they transform and they kind of change. The one on the right, again, was someone I met in the town in Barry. From a drawing, this became a watercolor that has been textured, and it just gives us an insight into the psychological state of that person as well. Both of these are looking away from us, that are out of the canvas. And there was a theme that I kept seeing over and over at that particular time when I was making many, many, many portraits and drawings, particularly in Barry and towns like Barry, and they're dotted all over the UK and beyond. There's a lack of confidence, really, and that kind of can be seen maybe in the lady on the right, where she's kind of looking away from us, almost maybe a little bit withdrawn, and there's barriers between her and us with these kind of marks around. So we have to get through those layers to find out a little bit more about how they're kind of feeling the portrait. But we've all had times like that ourselves, so we can, when we start to spend time and gaze into it, that'll reveal certain aspects of our character as well. And then another one, which is another lady that I met. Drawing took place many years before this, and then it was exploring a different aspect and different kinds of ways and different kinds of treatments. We talked about, like we saw in some of those other iconic pictures, where the light is right in the center and we're drawn to that center. But in this case, it's about, again, the transience of a person. Nothing is particularly solid. We're all moving through this situation we call life. We might think, get it pinned down for 1 second and then it's off again. We're going through this river that's constantly flowing, and all our component parts, sometimes we're together, sometimes they seem to split apart. Sometimes we feel something specifically detailed and specific. Other times we feel that the cosmos is vast. So these kinds of ideas are all being kind of portrayed in this iconic picture. So, all right, start off with a portrait of someone you meet, and you use that as the basis in this terms of those kinds of ideas. but then it can be so much more. Portraiture has the opportunity to explore all these different kinds of things. And then two portraits here are part of a bigger artwork, which included 19, I think, or 20 portraits in the artwork. Each of these people were kind of drawn and gathered together, and then the picture was kind of compiled. And what you get is this multi-layering quality. This is a picture that was painted in oil paints, but underneath it was texture and acrylic and things like that. So it kind of builds up over time to give you that opportunity, this multifaceted quality of the figures. But often, it's about trying to get below the surface of how people are kind of, for me, is how they're kind of feeling and how I'm having this relationship with them. Something which is kind of touching or resonance or some kind of truth that you think might be universal about a certain specific characteristic of someone. And then they share that with you, and then you can kind of engage in that quality to make your portrait. Then there's something has to have that kind of spark in it. It's got to be something revealing for them and for you, and it's got to have something which is kind of going to be maybe of a benefit in some way when you kind of work through the process. It's not just a surface kind of decoration. It's much more than that. It's a psychological state, like we mentioned in a Rembrandt picture or wherever, which is part of the motivation for an image like this. And I'll show you a few different kinds because obviously we do different kinds of portraits, and that's lovely and fine as well. And these are two different kinds of portraits. Got the man in the Tibetan hat, an oil painting, again, contemplation, introverted, reflective, and then we got the Dalai Lama image on the right hand side. I did meet the Dalai Lama, but not quite a few years after this, but at a distance with 10,000 others in the Albert Hall. But I've always wanted to meet him. But obviously, for me, he's been a lot of inspiration. So sometimes it could be you spend a lot of time studying or reading about a certain thing, and you're engaged with a certain kind of ideal sense of your relationship to life, and then a portrait can symbolize that. So you can make your portrait, say for example, it sounds a bit banal or different, say you wanted to be a dancer, and you found and you studied dance for many years, and then you found an image of a dancer that seemed to sum up everything you aspired to. Maybe they were a great ballet dancer or whatever. Then you make a portrait of them, and then you can imbue all those attributes into that portrait, So it's kind of a portrait in reverse almost. Every portrayal is ultimately for the artist, it's a reflection of them first. And then like Jackson Pollock said, all good artists paint themselves, you can't really get away from that. But then you got to move from that and move through that when you're with a sitter or around a sitter and get the aspect of them back in it. So you get this cyclical kind of dialogue going on. But you can come to a portrait from two different aspects, if you like, two quite poles apart aspects in that respect. And so that wasn't, the Dalai Lama was an image that I was fascinated by, philosophy and everything else, for many, many years, and that became an iconic image of him. And then these are sitters that were actually in front of me, and you have an immediate dialogue with them. So you really sense their presence. On the left, you've got Darcus Howe, was a civil rights activist, fascinating life on many levels. He was one of the founders of the Notting Hill Carnival. He stood up in the Old Bailey for 16 weeks defending, I think it was 11 black men after a riot and someone died, and he managed to get them all off. He was a force, an imperfect force, but a very honest and direct kind of transparency to him. he kind of had resolved a lot of any internal conflicts in him, and then he shared that in the image. And then on the right, Winfried, he had a life where he was an alcoholic and he struggled for many years. It kind of transformed his life to what from the outside would be total disaster, but then he turned it all around. And when I met him then, he'd been sober for 22 years, and he set up a project to help other addicts right throughout the country. So he transformed suffering, I feel like. And it's interesting the characteristics of the two different people, just those lines and the spaces between the lines can say so much about their characters. If you're passionate about your subject, then you'll find a way, your own unique way of expressing your relationship with your sitter. And these are part of a larger, bigger portrait that's been going on for the last 8 or so years, which actually reaches a landmark. I would have painted 3,000 artworks on 3,000 consecutive days. Now that's a bit crazy, isn't it? I know, but when you see all 3,000, if anyone ever did, or ever wanted to, that's an incredible portrait. Would be coming through. These icon pictures, as I see them, from the old icon tradition, are images of a deep reflection on a state of being. Okay, and hopefully, particularly the one on the right, gives a sense of joy and uplift, and the one on the left refers to different kinds of cultures and insight into different kinds of cultures, and there's a relationship between the two. And then when you string a number of these images together, of course, then they build up a bigger and bigger portrait. Okay, Andy Warhol used 9 images to create his Marilyn image. In my case, at the moment with this, it's 3,000. No rush, is there? And then just look at a few more quickly. We've got a Scottish artist, Ian Whinnie. Just a nice direct approach to the painting, but we get a psychological state, a relationship between the two figures there. He started off as a ceramicist, but we can kind of engage with the look and the dynamic quality that's happening between the two of them. And then we've got Christian Hook. Any of you been watching Portrait Artists of the Year? Christian Hook has come out as, incredibly, he has an amazing facility for capturing a likeness. He can capture it so well and so committedly that he can explore other avenues of portraiture, and he does. You see, if you watch the programs, that he kind of explores the dynamic quality of a living force, and that comes across in him and his choice of subject matter, and how he kind of uses paint in a very free way. He creates accidents in his painting. He lets it kind of become a mess for a while, and then he contains it back again. And then his pictures become, very energetic and very dynamic, held together with these really interesting kind of reflections of the sitter. So he's one to have a look at. I introduce you to all these different ones so that you get a chance, if you want, you can look at back at a later date. Later one now, George Melly of David Hockney. He painted a series of portraits again. I think 82 portraits and one still life. One still life was one of the sitters, which didn't turn up. So they were 82 of his friends. So although they're portraits of the sitter, they're also portraits of David Hockney and his relationship between all those other people as well. So again, while I was talking about running things in series to say more about the specific person in front of you, Hockney creates a lot of joy often in his pictures, and that's by the use of his colors. These turquoises, these pinks, there's spatial, dynamic, high resonance color, which just excite us. So if you're person you're making a portrait of has got those qualities, put those in. And then we just get a couple more. This is an artist from Lithuania. She's used a kind of graphic way of portraying the sitter, flat areas of color with these different clearly defined iconic little shapes, whether they be circles or triangles or rectangles, but flat areas, and they create almost like a poster effect, but it's an engaging way you can break down an image to create something which is interesting. And this is the last one, the portrait by British artist Jane French, who's got, again, going right back to where we started with the Durer picture. She's got face on, front on, confrontational, straight in dialogue with with us, from the portrait, from the sitter, and then there's a lovely light hitting the left hand side, creating form and interest and intrigue, and then vibrant colours that we saw in the Hockney there to create a kind of sense of uplift and joy. So different things going on simultaneously. I'm mindful of the time. So there you go.
If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe and click the bell notification.